Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Pride Month. And welcome to you from across Turtle Island for today's presentation, which is about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, two-spirited, and bi employees in the public sector. I'm Cheryl Camillo, a faculty member at JSGS. I teach social policy and health policy. And early in my policy career, in the early to mid 1990s, I worked for the United States' largest gay and lesbian organization, the Human Rights Campaign, earlier the Human Rights Campaign Fund. And among the things I did there was help develop by writing and then introducing and building support for federal legislation to prohibit discrimination in employment based on sexual orientation. And it's a pleasure for me to now explore the issue of employment for gay and lesbian people 30 years later. So I'm very pleased to moderate today's event. JSGS, or the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy, is a hub for advanced study and research in public policy, public administration, and health administration in Canada. Our school is a partnership between the University of Regina and the University of Saskatchewan that was based on the spirit of cooperation and collaboration that defined Saskatchewan. Since our inception in 2007, 15 years ago, we have swiftly become one of Canada's leading policy schools for educating graduate students and public servants interested in and devoted to public values. I would like to acknowledge that while today's event is taking place online via Zoom, JSGS's physical homes are on Treaty 4 and 6 territories, the homelands of the Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis. And one of our speakers, Tyler, is joining us from Edmonton, Alberta, which is also in Treaty 6 territory, and is a gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, which includes the Cree, the Blackfoot, the Métis, the Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others. And I make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside on or are visiting. For those of you who are new to the EDI discussion series at JSGS, we're very glad you joined. This series focuses on engaging current and future public servants on issues pertaining to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we're proud that it's supported by the Max Bell Foundation, which encourages the development of forward-looking innovations that impact public policies and practices. If you'd like more information on the Max Bell Foundation and their working projects, please click the link in the chat that Karen Jaster will provide. As you can see, Karen is updating the chat with some important information. As the title of this session suggests, we will focus on lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, two-spirited employees in the public sector, their workplace experiences, their perspectives, and the characteristics or requirements of workplaces that maximize or could maximize their contributions. Our speakers will be sharing personal experiences, and the topics that will be discussed today may trigger for some of you or may re-stimulate trauma. So we want to recognize your need for safety measures to minimize any risks associated with triggering. So again, in the Zoom, you will find a list of resources that you can consult if that would happen, but we hope it doesn't. The format for today's event is going to be a fireside chat. After I introduce the speakers, our panel will engage in a conversation about a series of questions. There will be 5 questions I'll pose to each panelist. If you have questions or comments about the discussion around each of those questions, please use the Zoom chat function to send it to me, Cheryl Camillo, that's C-A-M-I-L-L-O. You'll see my name in the chat there. Send it anytime, and I will gather those and pose them as I can. Once each of the panelists addresses the 5 questions I'll pose initially, we'll open up this virtual floor for a broader discussion with other questions that you send to us in the chat. If you have any logistical questions or experience any technical difficulties, please send a message via the chat to Karen Jaster, LaForge, Jaster, or you can send an email to her, karen.jaster@uregina.ca. Finally, to help this event run smoothly, we ask that you stay muted and turn your video off during the presentation portion of the event, but you can turn those on for the Q&A. As you would have seen when I initiated this session, like with all of our EDI presentations, we do record them so that they're available for viewing later by those who weren't able to join us live. They'll be on the JSGS website. So now that all those logistics are out of the way, I would like to introduce the panel whom I've had the great pleasure of getting to know over the last month or so. First, and she's in the middle of my screen, is Krystal Nieckar. She is the executive director with OUT Saskatoon. She's a white queer woman born and raised in rural Saskatchewan town on Treaty 4 territory. And she is very passionate about advocacy, frontline support, and working with the community. And I'll add that that's broadly defined. Krystal really, really believes and works in community and furthers our community here in Saskatchewan. Tyler Boyce is the executive director with the Enchanté Network. It's a national network connecting, supporting, and advocating for nearly 200 two-spirited lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer identifying organizations around Canada. And that includes pride centers like OUT Saskatoon and two-spirit societies. He is a Kenyan and Somali Black queer public policy professional and community organizer with 9 years of advocacy and leadership experience and a deep grounding in social justice, particularly as it is informed by Black queer feminist thought. And you'll hear that. You'll hear his passion come out. Malin Rosen is the education chair with the Government of Saskatchewan Pride Alliance Network. They are a proudly non-binary, trans, and queer individual, and they are engaged in gender-affirming education, advocacy, and peer mentorship. Malin was a key contributor and editor for the gender transition guidelines recently released by the Government of Saskatchewan for employees. And that's a significant accomplishment and one that I would be proud to see any of JSGS's graduates be involved in. So welcome, panelists, and I will transition to our questions. And the first question I'm going to ask Krystal to respond to first. That is, can you speak to what decent work is for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, two-spirited communities in your sector?
Okay. Hi, everyone. I guess it's good afternoon. Good afternoon here in Saskatchewan. Yeah, this is a really great question. So thank you, Cheryl. Decent work, meaning what? And so I went on a little hunt to find out what decent work means. And by the International Labor Organization, decent work is defined as productive work for people in conditions of freedom, equity, security, and human dignity. And so, you know, for us here at OUT Saskatoon, it's important for the folks here to be valued and for to feel value, to find value in their work. And then you add the pandemic on top of that, and decent work becomes very big in how do we meet the needs of the folks that work here? Because here at OUT Saskatoon, we cannot do any of this work if we don't have employees who are engaged and interested to work here, and also healthy, happy people. Because this work, as you know, if you're coming from a nonprofit lens, this work is hard. It is hard. It takes a lot of emotional labor. It takes a lot of oftentimes reliving your trauma, re-triggering the trauma that you have as a queer person, to be able to do this work alongside other queer people. Community work is no joke. I will preface that. It is honestly, if, you know, from my perspective, this work, you know, and I started with OUT Saskatoon 5 years ago, doing housing and support services. And this is by far the hardest job I've ever had in my 20 years in nonprofit work. And I've exclusively worked in nonprofit. And, you know, for us as an organization, and now that I'm in this role as an executive director, and I'm looking, you know, I'm not an employee, I'm a leader in the community, making accommodations for folks. It's decent. It's the right thing to do, whether that be, and now that we're in pandemic times, working from home, if it's just general workplace accommodations, which we make those anyways, but then also making time and space for folks to have extra time off if they need to, without docking pay or without you know, having to take a vacation day. They get some time in lieu for the work, for their time and the labor that they put in. You know, making accommodations for special events, because we're in Pride now, you know, giving time for folks to attend a flag raising, for folks to be able to, you know, things that give them joy, that give them spoons. That's how we talk about, you know, getting the value out of work. That's how we talk about it here at OUT Saskatoon. Do we have enough spoons to be able to do this work today? So, you know, in terms of how we make accommodations for people, it's essentially meeting them where they're at to allow them to do the best work that they can do. Right now, we're floating around a pilot project for a 4-day work week, which is very cool. And I'm glad to say that we are working hard to accomplish this, because, you know, in today's day, it takes more than just 48 hours to recover from a work week. And so we're finding that as the pilot project is running on, people are requiring less time away from work. They're requiring less sick time. They're requiring, you know, to the debrief sessions and all of that stuff, the equity work. It requires less time because folks have an opportunity to be removed from work and be able to also like interact in their personal lives and continue to build community. So I guess maybe to wrap this up, at OUT Saskatoon, for us, you know, decent work means safety, being allowed to be your full authentic self, and not being afraid to share your life with other folks. It means community, being able to build that space and create, because we need community to survive. It really does take a village. Ensuring that their well-being and their sense of accomplishment is met. So, you know, accessing professional development, being able to attend sessions like this, and then really, I want to hammer home the value of the individual, the value of the work, making sure that is met, you know, right at the start.
Thank you, Krystal. And it struck me that OUT Saskatoon can be a leader in these days when we're talking about the great pandemic retirement and how to keep people happy while working, that some of the practices that you've implemented in your workplace could be translated to other work sites and make for a productive, happy workforce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's important. So we're giving it a try.
Great work. Malin, can you talk about decent work in your sector, which is the public sector in Saskatchewan?
Hi, yeah, thank you. So I kind of wanted to start off by saying that, you know, like LGBTQ plus folks, you know, need the same kind of supports that everyone else does in terms of living wage, paid sick leave, respect for work-life balance. That kind of connects in with what Krystal's talking about with the 4-day work week and what people actually require to recharge from work. Healthy workplaces that take anti-harassment seriously and that sort of thing. But additionally to that, I wanted to highlight a couple of other items that are particularly relevant for trans folks in the workplace. One, that when it comes to benefits and health benefits in particular, often there's a major lack of support for gender affirming treatment for trans folks. And gender affirming treatment is really critical for trans people. So often they go deeply out of pocket to pay for it. And that's the kind of thing that, that a workplace can do to majorly benefit trans employees that they have. Of course, we, in Canada, we've got a lot of public health, is a lot of health services are paid for, but when it comes to hormones and a lot of the aftercare and that kind of thing that goes into surgeries, it's just not covered at all. So we have some of these kinds of things covered already under the government plan that I'm under, but not all of it. So it's an important thing to look into if you care about inclusion and diversity for LGBTQ, for trans folks in particular. Access to mental health support is also incredibly important for trans and queer folks. There's a lot, higher rates of trauma, of mental health challenges, and that just comes from the overall, I guess, lack of acceptance that tends to be in society, or that folks have experienced from their own families growing up or as they came out. So access to mental health support is really critical. If to the extent that workplaces are able to provide that. As you might know as well, kind of our mental health supports that exist in the province right now are kind of limited. So that's again a thing that people are going deeply out of pocket to pay for their own therapy, and that puts a lot of strain on people when they're even able to afford it in the first place. And then beyond those kind of more, I guess, critical concerns, I also kind of wanted to point out something that I don't think people always realize affects queer folks when they're looking for work or when they're in the workplace. And that's the dress code, and that's both when it comes to like the formal dress code that's written down, as well as just how people tend to present themselves in the office. Traditionally, professional dress has been really, really gendered, and men are in suits. Women in a lot of workplaces, less so now, but are still required, for example, might be required to wear skirts and pantyhose and heels. And when you're queer, and part of what you've been exploring is your expression and what feels comfortable to you, a lot of these dress codes can be really, really restrictive, and can make you feel unwelcome or not like yourself in the workplace. So if you're looking, if you're looking at being more inclusive, taking a good hard look at that dress code and what's actually professional or not, and what's important to define as professional. So, clothes without rips and tears, definitely, maybe, no tank tops, whatever. But when you're looking at things like really gendered expectations in particular, but also things like bright clothing and that sort of thing, it's something to look at kind of critically, because it can really affect whether or not people are going to feel like they even can apply to your workplace, or whether people are going to feel like they're going to be welcome there as themselves. So, yeah, that's mainly what I want to talk about there. Maybe one more note as well about the importance of employee networks for larger organizations. I'm a member of, the Pride Alliance Network, which is a very sort of grassroots-based network in the government of Saskatchewan. And it's having that sort of opportunity for connection and mentorship is really valuable for people who might not have as much, again, like family or community support, might not have been able to have the chance to develop some of those soft skills and kind of just knowledge about how the workplace operates. Just giving them that opportunity to gain some of that with folks that they know are going to be accepting, right, and supportive. Is really valuable as well.
Thank you, Melon. And as you were talking about gender expectations in the workplace, I was thinking back to a time in around 1993-94, I took a woman named Lila, who preferred to use Lyle, and her partner Diane to a congressional office for a congressman from northern New Jersey to talk about legislation. And Lyle reached out to me beforehand because she wanted to wear a suit with a tie and was concerned about the reaction. And when we sat down with the member of Congress for at least half an hour, not only did we have a great conversation about the legislation, but I could see over that period of time the comfort level of being open to different forms of dress and not rigidly thinking that this is a woman, she must wear a dress or a skirt. Really, in just that half an hour of exposure, made a huge difference and a lot of progress. There's a question in the chat, but I'm going to ask Tyler to address the question first and then come back and raise that for each of you.
Absolutely. So hi, everyone, and happy Pride. First, I'd like to really just thank the school, so the Johnson Shoyama School of Public Policy, for inviting me to this conversation. As a public policy professional, it's really happy to be back in a school of public policy. I feel like listening to my colleagues speak about decent work, I was taking notes, and that's sort of the best sort of part of these type of informal fireside chats. You get to learn as much as you get to contribute to the space. So I'm really looking forward to the questions later, but I'm sitting here thinking to myself, how can I contribute to the two amazing folks that went before me, right? So Krystal was talking about accommodations, talking about safety in the workplace, talking about a healthy staff and what she does at OUT Saskatoon, which is a major center. Malin was talking about gender affirming care, about mental health supports and kind of gender expectations in the workplace. So what can I add? I'm the executive director of Canada's largest network of queer, trans, and two-spirit organizations. We have about 200 independent organizations like OUT Saskatoon from coast to coast to coast. And I really have the privilege of learning every day in this position. So when we talk about decent work, what can I contribute? Well, I think that kind of the line that's going through, or if I could summarize what my colleagues have already shared, is really the term, it's a cultural shift. Decent work is so much more, even though it includes benefits and accommodations and just being a decent human being. Decent work is a cultural shift within our organizations that really embeds the values that drive collective action, that drive data justice, labor justice, and implement a truly intersectional anti-oppressive framework to the ways that we do our work with the communities that we have the privilege to serve, and the ways that we take care of each other. As often folks, like, we have lived experience, right? I'm a Black queer executive director, but I'm also a queer person, a Black person, and navigating the world with those identities that come along with it, right? So when we think about decent work and what we can kind of do like actionably, it's that we can challenge our employers, challenge governments, and challenge our programs of research in a university space to discuss decent work in a way that really asks those hard questions. How are we embedding the principles of racial justice into the ways that we're leading our organizations? How are we embedding the principles of disability justice into the ways that we're doing this work? When we talk about decent work within the nonprofit sector, and that's where me and Krystal come from, right? And that's where we're sitting as leaders in this space, we can see that there's a huge gendered aspect to the nonprofit sector, where a lot of this heavy labor typically falls on women and femme-presenting folks. So how are we talking about decent work within the context of a gender binary? How are we talking about decent work within the context of what society expects femme-presenting and women to do, the type of work that they're expected to engage in? And I'm not the one to lead that conversation, but I share it here so that we can take those lessons back to our organizations and really talk about decent work from a holistic framework, because it really is walking towards this radical direction hand in hand with other movements. whether it's a movement for gender equity, a movement for racial justice, a movement for 2S LGBTQI plus inclusion. We have to be characterizing decent work in a way that holds employers accountable, because in the end, it's for the people accessing our services to access them in a decent way. And that happens with a decent workplace from the very beginning. So thanks to my colleagues for sharing. I got the privilege of going last.
Thank you very much, Tyler. And this is a perfect segue into the question that came from Tamala, who's on the board of UR Pride at the University of Regina. She's thinking about all the accommodations that you mentioned that really, that make for the most productive workplace. And she's posing specifically to Krystal, but the others may want to respond to this as well. Do you spend more on human resources? Do you need more people to cover the workload because you do allow for someone to leave the office to go to a Pride event to feel happy and good? Does this sacrifice customer or stakeholder service?
Sure, that's a great question and one that I get asked often. And for us, I originally started out in the disability sector myself, working with folks who have disabilities, and my perspective on working with community and working with folks is that people always come first. And so, you know, for us at OUT Saskatoon, clients always come first. And so we try to meet the needs of those people to the best of our ability, if we're also at our best. And so, you know, surprisingly enough, there's the occasion when we need to close the drop-in because we don't have enough staff, but it is rare. And, you know, I think what we try to do is bring community along with us. So if we are going out to an event and we have a drop-in full of community members, we're bringing them with us, whether we're walking or they're you know, hopping in a taxi or whatever the case may be. We're going together so that we can keep that community feel. And then, you know, I don't really look at it as a additional human resources that we you know, as an expense. I look at it as an opportunity to create long-term employees. You know, I'm not interested in employee turnover because I don't know if you all know, hiring employees and training them and working. I don't love that. I want to keep people who want to be here. And so I'm going to do what I need to do to make happy, healthy people love the place that they work at. And then also, as we know, all of the studies and the research shows that happy, healthy people who like the place that they work, the work increases. People are able to do more with less time because they're focused. So I don't know, that's the goal at the end of the day, is that. So the resources, the extra human resources are just, I look at it adds value to the organization. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. Malin or Tyler, do you have a comment in response to the question?
I think you said it perfectly, Krystal. Yeah, investing in the people leads to better work.
And I see Malin nodding their head as well. I will note, in response to what Malin shared with us about the important work they're doing in Saskatchewan, 30, even 20, 15 years ago, the conversation about queer people in the workplace was about having explicit protections so that they don't be fired. One of the documents I took to Congress when I was lobbying for such legislation was a termination slip of a woman named Cheryl Somerville, who worked at a Cracker Barrel in Georgia, said this employee is being terminated because this employee is gay. It's great progress, not just for queer people, but for all people, that the conversation has shifted in Saskatchewan to what benefits allow people to be most productive in the workplace. Malin was talking specifically about health benefits, and as a social policy researcher, I know that when people are asked about how they choose a place of employment, it's often the benefits and the health benefits in particular that draw them to, that are equally important to drawing them to employment. So I'm going to stick with Malin and pose the next question to you first. And this is about visibility of queer people in the workplace, both to their colleagues within the workplace as well as to external parties. What value is there in workplace visibility?
Thanks, Cheryl. I'd actually just like to focus on kind of the internal benefits with my response here, and hopefully my colleagues can fill in some of the rest of that question. So one really important thing to understand is that I'd say probably most queer people can't really afford to approach a workplace with the assumption that it will be accepting. And that's, the reason will hopefully be clear with just from this, what you mentioned with, 15 years ago, the conversation was, let's prevent people from being fired, and society only changes so much. And so over time, this is a fact that might not be intuitive to understand if you don't come from a vulnerable minority group. But when you're approaching a workplace and you're queer, and you might not have a lot of community resources or family support to fall back on, the question of like, should I be visible at work really has to do with survival a lot of the time. And people worry, if I'm out, could I lose my job, or could I lose the respect and support of colleagues at work, which even if you don't get fired, that can lead to you needing to leave your job, like psychologically. And it's just not worth the risk to find out. So taking that back to, what the value of visibility is, if you're visibly accepting at work and you have visibly queer people at work, those are clear signs that this is an accepting workplace. And when you have those accepting workplaces, that takes that mental load off of feeling unsafe. If you're at your workplace and you feel like you need to hide who you are, or if people discover who you are, you might be in danger. That knowledge is kind of this constant, weight on you. And that has ongoing mental health effects. As a workplace, if you want happy, healthy, productive employees, then this is an area where you can work to remove what's hopefully, an unnecessarily mental load. If your workplace is becoming more visible and more accepting, it's probably you won't get all the queer people at your workplace coming out. Some people are still going to want to keep it private, but you're going to have more, and you get a little bit of work at the outset can lead to that kind of snowballing effect, because if you have a workplace full of people who are hiding who they are, then they actually have more support there than they realize they do. I can guarantee you that if you're working in a large organization, there are queer people on your staff who aren't feeling comfortable coming out. So I guess what it comes down to is, those the mental health benefits, which are going to have a lot of downstream positive effects for positive workplace culture and productivity.
No, you leave that.
Thank you very much for those comments, Malin. There was a comment that came into the chat that I'd like to share now. And it's from someone who started to work in the 80s, where there was no protection in most workplaces in Canada or elsewhere. And so the individual is finding that it's difficult even for a self-identifying queer person, and by the way, I'm using the queer term to embrace all of the terms, to adjust. And in fact, things have changed dramatically, where once a colleague might have taken offense for you to acknowledge your queerness. Now they might take offense if you don't acknowledge that and aren't very open, which I think reflects generational changes in self-expression. So the question is, how do we adjust to these generational differences when the public sector is very linear in its thinking?
That's a good question. And I think I I could kind of address that from either an individual or kind of like a systemic perspective. Like individually, I think we all kind of have to figure out where our comfort level is and what our boundaries are, you know, like what do you have to put in place to feel safe? And if that's not being out at work, you know, I think that's really important for you to acknowledge and do for yourself, you know. I think it's unfortunate that sometimes we do feel pressure to be out in situations where it might not be safe, you know, physically or psychologically, whatever the case may be. So, you know, together with acknowledging that there could be major benefits to other people in your workplace for you to come out personally, you're still important, you know, as an individual. You know, and then more systemically, I think, as this is a very high level response, so it might not be helpful to individuals. But what I tend to think is we've got, as a lot of the social norms we've had in place, you know, society-wise, we've gotten used to treating each other in certain ways or having certain expectations for how people behave. And as we have societal changes around things like sexuality and gender, then that challenges a lot of the things that we're just used to accepting or assuming. And I think we have to expect that there are going to be road bumps and things to sort out along the way. But that doesn't mean the change is bad. It just means that, you know, a lot of these things are like interconnected in ways we might not always expect until we run into them. So I hope that's not too airy, but those are my thoughts about that.
Very thoughtful. I'll have Krystal and then Tyler speak to this question of workplace visibility, and then I'm going to come to a really great question in the chat afterwards.
Okay. You know, when we talk about visibility, you know, I'm fortunate that I work at a queer organization, so we're living loud and proud over here. You know, when we're hiring folks, I'm like, you know, when they're sending their cover letters, I'm like, just please tell me, like, give me some sort of insight that you are in our queer family. I just, you know, I need it. Because we want the community to be reflected in the people that work here, and so we're fortunate that the folks who work here at OUT Saskatoon are queer, and you know that they're feeling safe to be able to work here because it is a visible space. And so I think more so I'll focus on external. What is it? You know, how do we work with external parties and being visible queer people, and particularly now that it's June. That pink washing effect is in full swing. And so for folks who may not know what that is, it's, you know, we support 2S LGBTQ folks like during June, and then June 30th hits, and then where's the support after that? So really, you know, our focus this year, particularly in June, is that, you know, queer folks are queer 365 days a year. And how can we, you know, for lack of a better term, how do we leverage your support to be able to support us visibly all year round? What can we do? How do we, we don't want it to just be like, yes, we want your support during June, but we also want it in September, and we also want it in January. What can we do to be able to spread that support around? And I know folks, you know, other community organizations and government and whomever, they want to ensure that queer folks know that you do support us, you know, during the largest month of the year for folks. But we're looking for equity long term. Yeah, I mean, I guess visibly, you know, for queer organizations, particularly nonprofit, you know, whether that's a community partnership hosting events, that sort of thing. But oftentimes queer organizations, and we'll probably get into this within the next question, I'm sure, but is financial support. It takes a large sum of money to be able to run the operations of an organization. And so, I would say externally being supportive for visibility is putting your money where your mouth is, I guess. I'm not sure that was a great answer, but yeah.
Very practical and pragmatic, which is important. Tyler, what are your thoughts about visibility?
Yeah, I think, visibility, representation, it's a topic that I think is important for us to talk about. So there was a question earlier from someone, I think in the chat, and I really appreciated that you really talked about a generational difference, right? So that's where I'll start my answer. That's where I'll start by giving a little bit about what I think. So intergenerationally, I think that when we look at some of the employment rights for queer, trans, and two-spirit folks, and the evolution of those rights, for me, I draw a straight line towards the HIV and AIDS activism of the 80s. So that activism, that kind of convening of queer folks to imagine a different world and to demand that world was exactly the kind of community organizing, grassroots organizing that allowed us to have some of the benefits we see today, like people in love able to access the pension of a partner when that partner passes first. Which is particularly relevant for the employment conversation we're having today, but it led to so many other expansions of our rights as queer people. So being able to be in the room with a loved one when that person is sick, it gets to inheritance rights. So it really cuts across so many different parts that impact our lives, and it all sort of started with that activism. Folks who are part of that activism are now our queer elders, right? So from a younger generation. So from, I think I'm still youth, like we can learn so much from these intergenerational conversations. And at the Enchanté Network, we're particularly trying to push that conversation through our networks like the Ottawa Senior Pride Network. So being able to connect a younger, like organizing to, I think is really beautiful to highlight in terms of visibility that we're doing. In addition, I think when I love visibility, I think I bring my own lived experience into it. Visibility is great, but I think we have to be careful not to err on the side of tokenism. So visibility without support there's nothing revolutionary about it, and it's not going to push us in any sort of radical direction. Visibility, representation with support is what's needed. So I'd rather have a conversation around what kind of support is needed to enhance this visibility. So as a leader of, again, the Enchanté Network, which is a huge network, right, in Canada, from coast to coast to coast, it's one thing to have a leader with lived experience. It's a whole other thing to ensure that that leader is empowered to lead in the vision that we hope will come from that representation. When we talk about visibility, when we talk about representation, we're essentially talking about different ways of seeing the world, different ways of imagining the world. And I would purport the idea that queer people do have the capacity to imagine a world that is very different than a world that has been dominated by white, heterosexual, cisgendered men for so long. We're really living in a world within the imaginations of a very particular segment of our overall society. So to imagine that one sole group has the single prerogative to determine how society should be organized, I think would be quite the fallacy. So moving towards what that collective vision could be from queer people, I think that we have the opportunity to imagine it in a way that doesn't center the same sort of power dynamics that lead to having conversations around marginalized groups or equity deserving groups or oppressed groups or vulnerable minorities or whatever the term du jour will be. Rather, I think that queer people have the opportunity to imagine what collective care could look like. What does a world look like when we center collective care for each other as the impetus and basis for that imagining? So when we get to visibility, I think it's a great foot in the door to a much larger conversation about what exactly is possible, while also acknowledging that queer people have a very particular, unique, and I would say powerful iteration of what that world could look like. So I really do welcome the question and say thanks.
And thanks for those comments. We at Johnson Shoyama, when we talk about policy making, talk a lot about innovation. In fact, we have a Center for Innovative Science. You use the word imagination. Imagination is essential for innovation. And the imagination we have 3 questions I'd like to pose before I move on to the third prepared question. One of our Master of Health Administration students has asked, what do you suggest for creating safe spaces where there are not those who currently feel like they can be visibly open in their workplace? Like it's really difficult to take those first steps to make public spaces safer. So what do you suggest? I'll start with Malin in this case.
Thank you. That's a very good question. Let's see. I think I do think visibility is one of kind of the key items. So, you know, if you look at so you want to look at, for visibility, you can look at the kind of the spaces, both like virtual and physical, that your organization kind of inhabits. So if you have like a website, if you have social media, what kind of images and communities are represented there? So even just coming down to like advertising, if you typically have advertisements with, say you run conferences, and you have advertisements with people sitting in a conference room, do they typically look like heterosexual? Are they wearing very like gendered clothing, or there's more? Is there more of a range? Like how queer does your imaging look, and how can you incorporate more of that? In things like job advertisements, you know, you might often see messages where, you know, we encourage folks from these groups to apply, or folks with these lived experiences, or where, or you can talk about the kind of things that your workplace does to be more equitable. So if you're part of a sorry, I'm blanking on this here, but if you're part of, you know, any, it wouldn't be like a network like the Enchanté Network, but there are other networks where you can partner with that help you to improve your support for queer folks. There's Pride at Work. There you go. Pride at Work Canada is one that comes to mind. So if you're partnered with organizations like that, putting those kind of things in your job advertisements helps send the message that you're a welcoming workplace. Things like in your offices, in your waiting rooms, if you've got bulletin boards, putting up just simple things like pride flags really help for that. I think, you know, the challenges beyond that as well to make sure that your employees are kind of on board with that as well. Because if you've got that imaging, but then that's not backed up with support from you know, management and staff and coworkers and that kind of thing, then it's not going to go very far. But I think that's where you get into things like education for employees, sensitivity training, that kind of thing. So hopefully that helps a little bit. I think there's a lot of possible actions to take, and we've talked about some of them in general in the rest of our questions as well. But that's what I'd have to add to what we've talked about so far.
Good concrete suggestions. I'm going to go to the next question, which is for this whole group. I'll ask Krystal to respond first because it comes from Elizabeth from Saskatoon. She asks, are there guidelines for safe and welcoming public washrooms for the queer community? Something that can be used to be implemented in her municipality, both in buildings for staff and then external and public space that the municipality might be responsible for looking after.
Yeah, that's a good question as well. Are there guidelines? Are there guidelines? We don't have a set of guidelines here at OUT Saskatoon, and I think it there may be guidelines from your municipality itself, but I guess what I would say, and this also can tie into the previous question that Malin was answering, is that having gender neutral washrooms available for people also sends a message. I think it depends on the style of washroom that you have. Even if they're like large stall, multi-stall options, there are ways in which you can make them gender neutral. And if you have single stalls, there's no reason for them to be gendered. It just comes down to that. And then, in terms of municipalities, oftentimes they're conservative, and it comes down to bravery, honestly. I think that it comes down to bravery.
Thank you.
And then building policy to reflect that.
When I hear brave to build policy, I hear leadership. and Elizabeth has a follow-up question, and I'll ask Tyler to respond to this before I move on in the interest of time. How does local government encourage or support the community in public meetings? What should local government officials do if they're running a meeting, say, for a long-term project, which is often the work of municipalities?
Oh, that's a great question, and a great question for where I sit, from a network perspective. Governments should definitely be centering community to lead those conversations. Governments who want to implement 2S LGBTQI+ programs have a range of different organizations in every single province and territory, and I know that because we have members in every single province and territory. There's a wide array of folks that they could be working with and bringing in to the conversation to really develop community-driven solutions to very durable problems. And I think that's the innovation shift when that might be missing. When we're talking about government, civil society partnerships, we really need to put community in the driving seat. And I think that's how we'll see some different results.
Thank you, Tyler. And I love this discussion because everyone's contributing. Riley, in response to the last question, said in the chat, there's a Public Service Alliance of Canada, which has a guide booklet on gender inclusive washrooms in the workplace. So thank you for that contribution. Another one of our participants noted that in this discussion about workplace, we should also think about relationship orientation. So, for example, the inclusion of polyamorous folks, at making them feel safe because it's a concept, and in some cases an identity that hasn't really been brought into EDI conversations or conversations about benefits yet either. So I'm going to continue on a policy thread. And my third question, I'm going to pose it to Tyler first, especially given the role of the Enchanté Network. Could each of you speak to the role of federal and pan-Canadian institutions in helping meet the objectives of your organizations?
Yeah. All right, Krystal, now I know what it feels like to go first. So kudos to you for getting us started at the very beginning. Federal institutions, so you said pan-Canadian, but I suppose I'll answer federally. So there's a huge role there. It comes from using the levers that exist at that level to affect change. Concrete examples, we can look at the first ever federal LGBTQ2 capacity fund, which was rolled out from this current Liberal government federally in 2019. So that was a huge multi-million-dollar investment in queer, trans, and two-spirit organizations that's never been seen before in the history of this country. That was an investment that allowed for many of the members that are part of the Enchanté Network to actually move from having maybe one paid staff or being volunteer driven to actually having the resources necessary to create the conditions for queer, trans, and two-spirit folks to thrive. A great example of the beneficiary from that fund was the Enchanté Network. And there's clearly an appetite for the work that we do that wouldn't have been possible without federal investment, right? So another role that the federal government, I think, can play is the role of data. So I have a master's in public policy, and data is my thing. It's what makes me really excited. I just see it as such a durable arm to activism. You know, when you collect that data and you, with principles of data justice, which I can talk about later, you're able to actually create this ripple effect that continues beyond one certain charismatic personality, but actually ripples across time and space. And that's why data is so important to me. So super briefly, we have the last Canadian census, right? For the first time in Canadian history, it collected data on trans folks. So all of us in this room at this hour, in this moment, are living through a time where we have a rough estimate of how many Canadians identify as trans, gender diverse, gender non-conforming. And that is amazing from now what's possible to come from that. I want to draw a straight line from the census and this data that we have, this national data on trans folks, towards the Employment Equity Act review process that's ongoing right now at the federal government. So it's going to get a bit public policy, but I think, you know, School of Public Policy is putting on the event, so I hope people want that. So we initially have the Employment Equity Act, right? It's a bit outdated. It covers 4 categories. Women, it refers to Indigenous folks as Aboriginals, folks with disabilities, and then visible minorities. So the rest of folks just lumped into that last category. So the federal government is going through this really exciting review process now of the Employment Equity Act. And for the first time, I think that there's the possibility that maybe queer, trans, two-spirit, and intersex folks could actually be included in this legislation for the first time, and that's so meaningful. Malin has talked about it at length, so I won't go on and on about the fact that trans folks experience a particular experience within the workplace, not just getting to the workplace, but also staying in a workplace. And that gets to a lot of the points that Krystal brought up about what it means to have a decent work environment for folks. So when we look at this Employment Equity Act review process, we link that with this new data that we have, we can see the monumental impact that pan-Canadian institutions, in this case, the federal government, can have on real life change for folks on the ground, being able to materially participate in society and materially provide for themselves in ways that they're not able to do right now. So my last point is, in addition to the data conversation and what governments can do, is that none of the capacity fund wouldn't have been possible without civil societies, without partnering with civil society. The Employment Equity Act review process wouldn't be possible without partnering with civil society organizations like the Enchanté Network. So when we talk about pan-Canadian institutions, I want us to be very sure that we're including network organizations like the Enchanté Network as intermediaries to really create that partnership between grassroots organizations, frontline workers with that real expertise, with those who have access to the levers of change at a national or federal level. Yeah, thank you for the question, Cheryl.
Thanks, Tyler. And I want to thank Karen Jester-LaForge for bringing together a panel of experts who represent different sectors and different levels of government in Canada. Malin, would you like to address this question from your perspective in Saskatchewan?
Yeah, and that was fantastic, Tyler. I feel like it's going to be difficult to follow that kind of that kind of in-depth answer, but I'll try to add a couple of things that I can see. So what I'd kind of emphasize is the importance of knowledge, both when it comes to gaining knowledge through data and surveys, but also just in disseminating knowledge to the people who need it. And in particular, when it comes to queer folks and queer organizations, there are a lot of things that we already know about what queer people need and what kind of supports are necessary, that knowledge isn't necessarily already with the people who have the power to make change. And so one of the reasons it's so important to fund queer organizations and queer groups is because they're the ones who know and are motivated to make those changes. We have in Saskatchewan, there's a small nonprofit called Trans-Sask Support Services, and they work with OUT Saskatoon on a number of things, or have. And they've done a lot of work to address gaps when it comes to trans people not just being able to access to supports, but even just knowing what supports are out there in the first place. They've got an excellent document that goes through things like how to make legal name changes and what kind of things you need to talk to your doctor about when it comes to medical support. It's a shame that unfortunately they've had their funding cut recently, and they were originally under the understanding that they could have, I believe it was up to 5 years of pretty sustainable funding as long as they kept on track, and that changed suddenly. So I also kind of want to emphasize when it comes to funding the importance of having that kind of like long-term or longer-term sustainable funding, so that groups can actually, finish the projects that they start out to create, and so that you don't end up losing those resources that you're building when it comes to knowledge and support of minority groups. One more thing I'd say, kind of from my perspective, is working on the gender transition guidelines. It's really valuable. It was really valuable for us to be able to reach out to other groups in other jurisdictions to find out what works for them, so we're not reinventing the wheel, as well as to sort of like add legitimacy to what we're doing as well. When we have to present it to folks in government who don't have the same kind of background knowledge or lived experience that we do, we can say, these are the other jurisdictions that do similar things. This is why we made these decisions when it came to our document. Just being able to coordinate interprovincially is really valuable for projects like that.
Thanks, Melon. Krystal, you're working very much on the ground. What are your thoughts about working within Canada's federal system with those federal and pan-Canadian institutions? Sure.
First of all, I want to say ditto to both Tyler and what Melon have already shared. The work that both of them are doing is great and expansive, and I don't know that I have a lot in addition to add to that, but what I will say is that relationships, policy making, and that institutional work is often the human component is removed, and I would say, at this point in time, OUT Saskatoon, we're fortunate that we are the second largest queer community center in Canada, following right behind the 519 in Toronto, which is like a $9 million organization. We're not nearly that big, but I'm proud to say in Saskatchewan, we are the second largest in Canada. And, I think, it's a lot of like hard, diligent work that we're doing to be able to create that space. And I think the asset that we have is that we, particularly in Saskatchewan and OUT Saskatoon, my predecessor, Rachel Walker, and myself, are really good at building relationships with people. So getting in front of people to have the conversations and share the knowledge, create that human connection, that feeling, where then folks who do make the policies and who are on the ground, in Ottawa or in Regina, making the policies, creating that human connection, so they're advocating for you on your behalf as well. I think that's what I would like to say about that.
Thank you. Relationship building is certainly an essential competency of public policy and public administration and public service more generally. I'd like to note that we've been talking about designing workplaces that can be supportive of all employees. And I'll note that despite the fact that we've moved beyond the typical Saskatchewan lunch hour of 1 p.m. here, that we still have 128 of our 156 participants online. So I hope that means many of them have accommodating workplaces. My next question is going to be one that may have been addressed, but please do add if there's something you haven't shared before. And I'll pose it to Malin first. Are there particular special experiences and insights that queer persons bring to the workplace, any workplace?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And firstly, I want to say I really appreciate the question, and I appreciate kind of the value that it has to, pitching changes to policy and workplaces. But it always, this kind of thing always rubs me a little bit the wrong way as well, because it seems to me that no vulnerable group should have to be special or provide special benefits in order to be worthy of respect and inclusion. And I think that goes back to, some of what Tyler was saying about, creating, I can't remember his wording, but a society that where we're supporting each other, where it's not this othering kind of situation of like, how do we help these poor folks over there? It's about how do we create really like a mutually supportive society in the first place. So having said that, when it comes to, I will try to answer the question a little bit, when it comes to what kind of benefits I think queer folks bring to the workplace. I think, human beings are social animals, and we all learn from each other. And there's real benefits to that, but also there's a real tendency, I think, to go with the crowd a lot of the time. So I think one of the benefits to diversity in general is if you have folks who are outside of the mainstream in one way or another, they're going to have maybe more of an ability to see what the mainstream might be missing. And also, there's a certain amount of, I think, determination and grit that kind of develops in people when they have to constantly be dealing with that tension between what everyone else is doing. Even in a very accepting society, there are these pressures that people feel to, I think, go along with the group. So when you have that kind of a tension, you're developing capacities that people who have never had that tension might not have the same opportunity to.
Malin, to your point, I'm reflecting on a conversation I had with a colleague who actually formed in the US Congress the first gay employees organization. And we were talking about retirement because we're of an older generation. And she said, well, we have to take care of each other, because back then we weren't the traditional model of having children and having them planning for them to take care of us. And really thinking, I work in health policy, thinking about long-term care and the needs of people who are aging and maybe no longer able to take care of themselves. This is to your point, which is, that's really an issue for everybody, because we have a very mobile society and people don't necessarily live in the same community as their children. So work that queer people might have done a couple of decades ago to think about how to take care of themselves in old age could really transfer quite well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you.
Krystal, your thoughts on special experiences and insights?
Sure. I actually really love this question. And again, I the privilege that I have to be able to work where I work. We talk about our community as the folks here, it's queer magic. When we get to do some very cool things here at OUT Saskatoon, and because I also think because we work in nonprofit and we have we're not an institution. We get to do cool things in a timely manner as well. You know, the policies in which we can create or adapt as we need to actively meet the needs of the people in real time is very cool. And so then we get to do very cool things like build a youth group home for queer youth. You know, we see a gap in services. Let's fill it. You know, to speak to some of the earlier points, you know, where Malin had mentioned around the cost associated with gender affirming care. OUT Saskatoon has built a fund where trans folks, gender non-conforming folks, non-binary folks can apply to receive funding to assist with that care. You know, because it is expensive and a lot of it is uncovered. You know, particularly like travel, for example. So, which you can all donate to, by the way, on OUT Saskatoon's website. You know, and then to talk about, you know, we have to remember where we came from. So Cheryl, you know, you were mentioning about the folks, the leaders, where we came from, the history, our stories. It's so important to remember the work, you know, when the AIDS crisis hit and, you know, the women of the community, that they took care of their friends. You know, they became the hospice spaces. You know, we think about our history, and I actually just worked on a project with the library archives talking about the importance of collecting our history and doing a really great job of it, but also ensuring that we are being intentional and intersectional about it, and that we are gathering everyone's stories and not just the specific, not just the people with the loudest voices. And so, yeah, you know, particularly in our office space as well, I think that we have an opportunity to always not just meet the status quo, but beat it in ways in which we interact with the community, the ways in which we write our policies, the way in which we, you know, even plan a strategic plan. You know, we have opportunities to be able to do things differently, and I think that we as queer people really invest in that, and you know, try and raise the bar a little bit.
Thank you. I love beat the status quo. That is something I'm going to share in my policy classes now as a way of orienting work. Tyler, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the question was like the unique contribution. So yeah, loved, Malin, what you said around, you know, you don't need to be excellent or extraordinary to be deserving of respect. That really sat with me, and Krystal, the beating the status quo stuck with me as well. I think that, yeah, when I think about what we bring differently, you know, I'm going to take a bit of like a different approach to answering the question. So as queer people, there's no like uniting sort of thing about us besides, you know, maybe our sexual orientation, our gender identity, our gender expression, and the ability to navigate those expectations. I think that sometimes there's this assumption that queer people are just all necessarily going to be progressive and have a very progressive politic. And we know that that's not true, right? With Pete Buttigieg in the US, we know that it's not always going to be queer people that are super lefty and ready to fight for the little guy, despite what you see on the panel in front of you today. So that brings me to I guess what I'm thinking about when I heard this question, which is like, who are we then as queer people? And what type of politics, what type of worldview, what are we gonna fight for as a community? And as I stand at the helm of this national network organization inspired by groups like OUT Saskatoon, the 519 community in British Columbia, Quadrangle in Newfoundland and Labrador, like you think about what are we going to fight for? The HIV/AIDS crisis really brought us together, and we fought that fight, and we're still fighting it today. Marriage equality, at least in a binary sense, We fought that fight and we got to this milestone in it. The blood ban is something Enchanté is fighting for right now. The decriminalization of sex work. And now we have to ask ourselves, what are we going to fight for next? And there's such a long list of things we could be fighting for, but I want us to remember, I guess, that as we approach those conversations, we are not necessarily above reproach. We are not necessarily, and for folks on the call, not all queer people are going to take an intersectional approach to the work. And for a long time, in many different instances, maybe it wasn't like that. So we need to be very careful not to be refolded into the logics of domination, white supremacy, patriarchy, sexism, and be really conscious of the ways that, like we've been saying this whole panel, we can imagine a different world. We can imagine a better world. So when I think about the unique things that we bring together, it's this really unique vantage point, and what we bring to any space is going to evolve over time, but it's going to be for us to continually recycle, reuse, reimagine what that means for us as queer folks, and bless the rest of the world with that really powerful perspective on what we could do together.
Thank you, Tyler. I know June is Pride Month because it commemorates the Stonewall riots in New York City, which was an expression of anger, but yet the energy here is so spring-like, and I think it really fits well with the sunshine and the flowering of spring. So June is perfect for Pride Month. I have one more prepared question, and I'll ask it to Krystal first. But meanwhile, if you're participating, please do send in a question about any topic so that we can get to those toward the end. This question is, the focus of this session has been on queer communities, but does it make more sense to approach the discussion as well as policymaking in such a way as to include all of those who've been excluded from workplaces in the past by either explicit or implicit policies? That could include women, disabled individuals, Indigenous persons, visible minorities, some of the communities that our EDI sessions over the year have addressed. Krystal, what are your thoughts?
Sure, thank you. I really like to sort of approach this as nothing about us without us. There shouldn't be policies that are created or built or made or, put into action without having the voices that it then impacts represented. I think also the intersectionality of even just the groups that you named, Cheryl, are the intersection. We're not just one thing. We've never been just one thing. And so, I fit into the category of, I refer to myself as gay. I'm also lesbian. I'm a woman. I'm a mother. I'm a sister. The intersectionality of all of those things. And policy is while it can be dynamic, is often very linear as well, right? And so how does it meet the needs of as many people as it possibly can? And I think that, as Tyler was saying, the way in which we imagine a different world, the way in which queer people organize, and the way in which queer people can create space for ourselves, it's possible. I think it's possible to then create policy that is reflective of the community as a whole, and I think that we're on our way. With the new policy that Tyler was mentioning before, the potential for that I think is great. And the Liberal government right now has an opportunity to create some real change, and be they've done a lot for human rights already in their tenure. And I think that the potential for this could be greater, particularly for OUT Saskatoon. What I will say is that right now we're really working as an organization to be, I don't like to use the word indigenize our organization. We're really looking at meeting some reconciliation. We're really working at decolonizing our workplace. And so, one of the ways that we're doing that is working with folks who then can help us do that. So I would recommend that to all the folks on the call. Bring these actions and be intentional about it. It's not something that you can just work off on the side of your desk. If you're looking to make the space more inclusive, or have more explicit policies about including everybody at work, it has to be something that you work on actively every single day. And that's, I really like to put my money where my mouth is. And so this is something that we at OUT Saskatoon are working hard to be able to be reflective of the people that we, the community that we work for. Yeah. And ideally, I would like to work myself out of a job. I'm a long way from that, but at the end of the day, that is the goal.
I teach my students that that's a great goal in policy. Tyler, your thoughts on this question? It might continue your thoughts on the previous question.
I was really intensely listening to Krystal. Do you mind repeating the question for me?
So we've been focusing on queer communities, but does it make more sense to approach policymaking in such a way that we're proactively, if you will, including all those who've been excluded from workplaces?
Absolutely. Yeah, I guess the question is about, the whataboutisms is what I tend to call them. It's kind of, if you make any step in a radical direction, any step towards human rights, there will always be the question of whataboutisms. Whataboutisms can be a huge barrier to progress. So the way that I tend to approach them is by reframing the approach to the question. Sometimes these the expectation and the burden, the responsibility to make sure that for groups that are already marginalized in society, to bring every other marginalized group with them in order to take one tiny inch of a step forward, is a huge burden to bear. And quite honestly, I think that those with the resources to actually hold that responsibility are those that are already in power. So rather, I think that the question should be posed to those with a lot more power than those on this panel. And when we're looking at the institution of the university, the institution of the provincial government of Saskatchewan, or the provincial government of Alberta or Ontario, etc., I think those questions need to be asked to them. What does it look like to actually take a holistic intersectional approach to the work? I think that two pillars can't be forgotten in that work. One is that Canada actively participated in the transatlantic slave trade. Black folks were owned as property in this country, and the logics of white supremacy continue to inform the realities of the ways that our public institutions interact with people who look like me. Another thing we need to keep in mind is that this is a settler colonial nation, and that there is a distinct responsibility of institutions to Indigenous folks, and that includes Two-Spirit folks. So as we have those historically grounded conversations, I think then we can move in a radical direction that puts the onus on those with the most resources to affect that change. And I'd like to see, for those in my network, those in this movement, to be able to think very clearly about what politic we stand for as queer people, what the implementation of intersectionality looks like in practice in the work that we do 365 days a year. And from there, I think that we'll have a really nice kind of synergy between civil society, but also between these institutions with many mechanisms to affect real transformative change in the country.
Thank you, Tyler. What you suggest sounds very fair to me. Melon, are there thoughts you would like to contribute to this question before I open up to questions?
Yeah, and I'll try to be sensitive to time here. I really, what Tyler said about the importance of putting the onus on the groups with the resources for intersectionality really resonated with me. Intersectionality, I think, is vital, and it also requires the more intersectional your work is, the more resources go into that. And so when you're, any group that's looking to do, I think, progressive work and make change needs to make really pragmatic decisions about how intersectional to be. Having said that, I think also whenever you're making decisions about that, you also need to acknowledge that the more intersectional you are, the more effective you're going to be, because what it's about at a certain level is just understanding better the complexity of human experience. So if you're looking at people just in terms, okay, how do we help gay and lesbian folks, right? Some of those folks are going to be disabled. Some of them are going to be transgender. Some of them are going to be operating on other axes of oppression, or just other situations in their life that can really change what those experiences look like for them. So it seems to me when you're making policy decisions in particular, if the more granular you can effectively be in terms of those identities and what they actually look like at those intersections, the better policy decisions you're going to be able to make. So I think just, from that kind of pragmatic standpoint, it's important to be as intersectional as you can.
Thank you, Malin. And when you were talking about intersectional work equals effectiveness, I was wearing my former policymaker's hat and thinking, absolutely, because understanding the needs of various communities is basically stakeholder relations, and incorporating those needs in policy that's public policy for all Canadians. It just makes perfect sense to me. Are there any questions that anyone would like to pose, either by posting them in the chat? We have time for probably one more. And I see one from Elizabeth from Saskatoon. She wants to know, what can she do to be a better ally? As a co-worker and also as a connector with the community, how can she be a better ally? I'd like to respond first.
I can quickly answer. And my quick answer would be that there are two parts for allyship, and then one overarching umbrella. The overarching umbrella is that allyship is an ongoing process. So there's no end point to being an ally. It's a conscious choice made every day. And the two kind of points that fall under that umbrella are that first, there is the identifying, like that it's very public policy of me, but first there's the problem identification. So acknowledging that there's a problem in power within the space that you're in. And then the second part, which many folks don't get to, which is really difficult, is letting go of power. For a lot of folks, we benefit from oppression, but we also benefit from privilege. So in what ways is our allyship aligned with the ways in which we're looking to let go of power? Maybe give different folks with different voices the ability to lead. I'm one of very few executive directors of a national queer organization in Canada. And a lot of them look a very particular way. So we all have something to contribute. And I think, like Malin had said, we're stronger when we take an intersectional approach to the work. And I really think that needs to be reflected in our leadership. So if you're building a team, think about what voices, what perspectives, and what lived experiences are informing the leadership agenda of any organization.
In the interest of time, I'm going to move to closings. I know at least one of our panelists needs to run to a meeting. I want to take this opportunity on behalf of JSGS to thank Tyler, Malin, and Krystal for the time they've spent, for their observations, their insights, and more importantly, at least I'm saying this myself, for the work that you do on behalf of all Canadians. So please join me in hitting the reaction buttons in the Zoom chat to give them some applause. If you enjoyed this lecture, look at JSGS's events calendar. You can find that on our website. There's links that Karen is providing in the chat, and join us for another. And it's 1:30 now, so I'll also say have a beautiful spring day. Hopefully it's sunny where you are, and happy summer. Thanks again, everyone.